Welcome. Today, we're diving into a really deep theological question, one that gets to the very heart of what it means for God to be wise. Could a being of perfect wisdom ever do something completely random? That question is going to lead us to a fascinating concept called Tasalsul hawadith, an eternal succession of events, and it makes a powerful case against the idea of a single first act of creation.
Okay, so let's start with the puzzle. Think about it. If an act is truly wise, it has to have a good reason behind it, right? So, if every single moment before creation was exactly the same, totally identical, what possible reason could there be to pick one specific moment over any other to start creating? You see the problem? Without a reason, that choice, it just seems arbitrary. And an arbitrary act is pretty much the opposite of a wise one. That's the challenge we're digging into.
So yeah, this brings us to our first big hurdle. The whole idea of a single initial creative act, it actually runs into a serious logical problem when you really think about what it means for God to be perfectly wise. Let's break down the argument step by step.
Here's how the logic unfolds. If every potential moment to begin creation is identical, then picking one specific, Tuesday, has no reason behind it. It's totally arbitrary. And for a being whose every single action flows from perfect wisdom, a fundamentally arbitrary act isn't just, out of character, it's a straight-up logical contradiction.
And listen to how the great theologian Ibn Taymiyyah puts it. He says perfection isn't just about having raw power. It's about acting in the way that wisdom necessitates. An arbitrary act, by its very nature, isn't necessitated by anything, let alone wisdom. This really drives home the point that purpose is absolutely essential to every divine action.
I love this analogy. It makes it so clear. Could God make it rain in the total vacuum of space? Of course, he has the power to do anything. But would he? No way. A wise being wouldn't, because it's completely purposeless. But creating rain over a parched desert? Now that shows purpose. It shows wisdom. So you see, the argument isn't about God's ability. It's about his perfect character.
So, if a single first act creates this logical mess for divine wisdom, what's the alternative? Well, this leads us to a really elegant solution. What if there was no first act at all, because God has actually always been acting?
And this brings us right to the main idea of this whole explainer, Tasalsul hawadith. It's the principle that God's creative action is eternal. There isn't one starting gun. Instead, there's an infinite succession of created events stretching endlessly into the past, each one willed by God. This just completely sidesteps the whole problem of an arbitrary first choice.
And you should know, this is not some weird modern idea. The famous scholar Ibn Qayyim pointed out that the earliest generations of scholars understood God's agency to be perpetual, that it extends infinitely into the past, just like everyone agrees it extends infinitely into the future. This was a foundational understanding for them.
Okay, I know what you're probably thinking right now. An infinite chain of events going into the past, doesn't that break logic? This is for sure the most common and powerful objection, so let's just tackle it head on.
It's a great question, a fantastic one, and philosophers have been debating it for centuries. The gut reaction for a lot of people is, no way, you can't have an actual infinity of past moments, but the answer really depends on what kind of infinite chain we're talking about. And it turns out, not all infinite regresses are created equal. Not all of them are logically impossible. The absolute key is to understand the huge difference between two types, a regress of dependency versus a regress of succession. Okay, this slide right here is the absolute heart of the whole argument. The impossible kind of regress, called Tasalsul al-ilal, is like an infinite line of dominoes. For the last one to fall, the one right before it had to fall, and so on, forever. Nothing could ever get started. But Tasalsul al-hawadith is totally different. It's more like a spring that has always been producing droplets of water. Each new droplet doesn't depend on the droplet that came before it. No, they all depend on one single external source, the spring itself. As the scholar Kamila Al-Kawari puts it so well, one created act does not cause the next one. They aren't dominoes in a line. No, God is the constant, perpetual agent behind every single act in this infinite chain. His action is what's eternal.
All right, so if the logic holds up, how does this square with religious texts that seem to talk about a first created thing? This is a really important point we need to reconcile.
Exactly. You've got scriptural accounts that mention the creation of the pen, or that God's throne was upon the water before he even created the heavens and the earth. And at first glance, that seems to directly contradict this idea of an endless succession of prior creations.
The solution that theologians offer is to realize there are two different ways to use the word first. Are we talking about the first thing created in our specific cosmic order, the universe we live in? Or are we talking about the absolute first thing ever created by God, with literally nothing before it? The argument is that the texts are describing the beginning of our world, not an absolute beginning for all of God's actions.
And this is precisely the case that scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah made. They argued that when the texts mention things like the throne and the pen, they're setting the timeline for this universe, the creation that you and I inhabit. They aren't making that much bigger metaphysical claim that absolutely nothing existed before them. Okay, this leads us to another really important clarification. If the chain of creation is eternal, does that make created things themselves, like you and me, eternal? Does it somehow put creation on the same level as the Creator?
The answer is a very firm no, and the distinction here is just brilliant. The category of creation, or what philosophers call the genus, is eternal, because God has always been creating. But no single instance of creation, no specific person, no planet, no galaxy, is eternal. This quote from Ahmad al-Najjar just nails it. By definition, to be created means that you were preceded by non-existence. There was a time when you were not. So, while God's active creating is eternal, no individual creation can ever be.
So let's pull all these different threads together and really understand the final takeaway. Why go through all this complex philosophy and theology? What's the bottom line?
So why does all this matter? Well, this whole concept of God's eternal action isn't just some abstract philosophical game. It's presented as a necessary consequence of believing in God's perfect wisdom. It totally solves the problem of a random first act, and it carefully distinguishes between a possible infinite succession and an impossible infinite chain of causes, all while making sure we never confuse the eternal creator with his non-eternal creation. And that leaves us with a final, really big thought to chew on. If we start to see creation not as a single event that happened billions of years ago, but as a continuous, eternal expression of divine purpose and wisdom, how does that change the way we see our own existence? What does it mean for you and me to be just one link in an endless chain of divine wisdom?